Senator Chris Van Hollen didn't just read a list of complaints into the record. For 7 straight minutes, he forced a moment of moral and institutional accounting. What does it mean when the U.S. Secretary of State treats foreign policy like a menu of political favors? What happens to people on the other end of those choices? Mothers in Sudan, students in American colleges, refugee applicants waiting for protection. I'm going to walk you through exactly what Van Hollen put on the table, why it matters, and what the alternatives actually look like.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you and I served together in Congress for 15 years. We didn't always agree, but I believe we shared some common values. A belief in defending democracy and human rights abroad, and honoring the Constitution at home. That's why I voted to confirm you. I believed you would stand up for those principles. You haven't. You've done the opposite. And you used to speak with conviction about the importance of foreign aid as a tool to advance American values and interests. Then you stood by while Elon Musk took a chainsaw to USAID and other assistance programs. That has left a staggering toll. Broken trust with countries, openings for China and other adversaries, and countless preventable deaths of children and others. Take Sudan, for example. The freezing of U.S. humanitarian assistance forced the closure of nearly 80% of the emergency food kitchens there. 2 million famine-affected people were left without access to food. People died because of those actions. Mothers, fathers, and children. Tons of emergency food that could have saved their lives was left rotting in warehouses because you and Elon Musk refused to let USAID do its job. Sudan is a country where, by the administration's own determination, a genocide is unfolding in Darfur. But here's where it goes from cruel to despicable. While cutting off food aid to Sudanese families living through an actual genocide, you're fast-tracking white South Africans for refugee status under a manufactured claim that they are the victims of genocide. You tried to block the admission of individuals who had already been approved to come here as refugees while making bogus claims to justify granting such status to Afrikaners. You've made a mockery of our country's refugee process, turning it into a system of global apartheid where political ideology and race, more than truth or need, matter. And while you've turned away from a genocide in Sudan and invented one in South Africa, you teamed up with President Trump to throw the Ukrainian people under the bus and have been played like a fiddle by Vladimir Putin. Of course, Donald Trump not only said he would end the war in Ukraine on day one, he also said he would end the war in Gaza on day one. And yet last week, you were all running around to Gulf states, giving away very sensitive American AI and chips technology, but doing nothing to end the war in Gaza and get the remaining hostages returned. You know that for 78 days, the Netanyahu government did not allow a scrap of food to enter Gaza to reach over 2 million civilians. 57 children have died from malnutrition so far, and more than 14,000 children are in imminent danger of dying of starvation. As Cindy McCain said last week, and I quote, "Families in Gaza are starving while the food they need is sitting at the border." That is a gross violation of both U.S. and international law. What did you do? Nothing. Not once did you publicly call upon the Netanyahu government to end the blockade. Fortunately, other countries spoke out, and now we see a tiny trickle going in. Where have you focused your energy instead, Mr. Secretary? Well, your first trip as Secretary of State was to El Salvador, not to promote democracy, but to cozy up to President Bukele, who calls himself the world's coolest dictator. The result was a cash for collusion deal to deprive people living in America of their constitutional rights to due process. The Supreme Court, in a 9-0 decision, instructed you to facilitate the return to the United States of Abrego Garcia, who the administration admitted was wrongfully deported to El Salvador. Your response? You've openly flouted judicial orders. When asked whether you have been in touch with El Salvador to return Abrego Garcia, you boasted, quote, "I would never tell you that. And you know who else I would never tell? A judge." Clearly, you don't care about the Fifth Amendment right to due process, and you don't care about the First Amendment either, since you've been very busy snatching students off of college campuses for exercising their right to free speech. You dredged up a relic from the McCarthy era to claim that student protesters posed a threat to the foreign policy of the United States. Give me a break, Mr. Secretary. You know as well as I do this isn't about national security, it's about punishing free speech. And you know that in America, the government doesn't get to use its power to punish speech it doesn't like. Yet in March, you boasted about revoking student visas, saying, and I'm quoting, "We do it every day. Every time I find one of these lunatics, I take away their visa," unquote. Let's look at one of those lunatics, Mr. Secretary, Ms. Ozturk. Her crime was co-authoring an op-ed in her college paper critical of Tufts University's response to the war in Gaza. Your own department found zero links to terrorism, no anti-Semitic statements, but you still yanked her visa and shipped her off to detention in Louisiana. And the list goes on and on. The federal judge in the case of Mohsen Madawi, who was the Columbia student who was ambushed by federal agents at his citizenship appointment, said, and I quote, this is the judge, "Legal residents not charged with crimes or misconduct are being arrested and threatened with deportation for stating their views on the political issues of the day. Our nation has seen times like this before, especially during the Red Scare and Palmer raids. Like the McCarthy-era witch hunts of the 1950s, your campaign of fear and repression is eating away at foundational values of our democracy. Back then, it took one voice, Attorney Joseph Welch, to cut through the hysteria with the simple question that marked the beginning of the end of that shameful era. He asked Senator McCarthy, have you no sense of decency? And I would ask you the same, Secretary Rubio. But you have shown through your words and your actions what the answer is. And I have to tell you directly and personally that I regret voting for you for Secretary of State. I yield back.
Van Hollen begins from a place that matters, shared history. He and Rubio served together in Congress. That makes the rebuke sting more, because it isn't abstract partisanship. It's a colleague saying, I thought you would stand up for institutions and human rights, and you haven't. That sets the tone. This isn't a debate about personalities, it's about principles. Van Hollen then threads together a set of concrete examples: USAID cuts, frozen food aid to Sudan, refugee fast tracks for white South Africans under dubious claims, visa revocations for students who wrote op-eds, and the apparent refusal to follow a unanimous Supreme Court ruling. Taken together, the portrait he paints is one where policy choices look less like coherent strategy and more like ad hoc power plays. Let's start with the humanitarian question, because it's the one where the human cost is clearest. Van Hollen points to Sudan, warehouses full of food rotting while people starve. He cites figures: massive closures of emergency kitchens and children pushed to the brink. That's not a talking point. That's a public health and human rights catastrophe. If a government blocks aid during a crisis that its own agencies and independent monitors call a genocide, the consequences are immediate and measurable: deaths, displacement, and the breakdown of local coping mechanisms. The policy explanation often given for cutting aid is that money can be diverted by corrupt actors, or that aid programs need reform. Those are policy debates worth having, but the question here is timing and proportionality. Are we willing to let people die while we tinker with oversight and bureaucracy? And is there evidence that the cuts were the least harmful option? Van Hollen's point is that the decision wasn't framed or defended as a narrowly targeted safety measure. It instead looks like a blunt tool that produced predictable suffering. That leads us to the refugee question. Van Hollen calls attention to a troubling double standard. Refugees fleeing genuine, documented danger in places such as Sudan faced more obstacles, while claims of genocide elsewhere, claims that many experts and observers dispute, were treated as grounds for expedited status. The refugee admissions process is supposed to apply consistent legal standards: credible fear, objective documentation, country conditions, and individual vulnerability. If those standards are applied selectively for political reasons, the entire refugee system is compromised. When the logic of the system becomes who do we want to reward rather than who needs protection, you don't just create winners and losers. You bankrupt the moral standing of the system and give adversaries leverage to paint U.S. policy as hypocritical. Next, consider the rule of law and separation of powers problem. Rubio's framing that diplomacy cannot be policed by courts and that judges can't tell the executive how to conduct foreign policy reflects a narrow view of executive latitude. Diplomacy does require confidentiality and flexibility, yes, but the Constitution and decades of jurisprudence also make clear that executive actions are not exempt from judicial review, especially where individual rights are implicated. The Supreme Court's unanimous order in the case Van Hollen raises, a 9-0 decision, is not a bureaucratic suggestion. It's a legal determination that raises concrete obligations. Ignoring such orders under the banner of diplomatic confidentiality risks turning foreign policy into a shield for lawlessness. That's not a hypothetical. Courts routinely balance national security and confidentiality against individual rights. The right balance is hard. Ignoring the judiciary entirely because you don't like the outcome is dangerous. Then there's the domestic civil liberties question. Rubio's boast about revoking student visas every time I find one of these lunatics is more than incendiary rhetoric. It signals a policy posture where visa power is used as a tool to chill dissent. We have long-standing norms in this country. Visas are privileges that can be revoked for clear security reasons. But there is also a long record of protecting speech, even speech that many find offensive. Decided example, a student co-authoring a critical op-ed and then losing her visa despite no terrorism connections, shows how quickly enforcement discretion can become coercion. That's a slippery slope. When the state uses immigration status to punish speech, it reaches beyond foreign policy into the domestic political marketplace, and that undermines academic freedom, debate, and due process. Finally, there's strategic credibility. Van Hollen accuses the administration of inconsistent signaling on Ukraine and Gaza. Strategic credibility matters because alliances and deterrence are built on predictable responses. If we tell partners we will act, and then we don't, or if we hand over sensitive technology without a clear strategy, we risk undermining the very security goals we claim to pursue. That's not about partisan scoring. It's about whether our diplomatic choices advance long-term national interest or create vacuums others, often adversaries like China or Russia, will exploit. So what would a better approach look like? First, humanitarian decisions should be guided by transparent criteria and immediate mitigation plans. If aid is paused for valid operational concerns, there needs to be a public, time-bound roadmap to restore it and to address misuse, not indefinite freezes that allow food to rot and people to starve. Second, the refugee process needs to be defensible on its own legal and factual grounds. If we expand protections, do so by clear standards that can be replicated and defended. If we limit them, do so uniformly, with a clear legal rationale. Third, executive discretion should be exercised with respect for judicial oversight when constitutional rights are implicated. Protecting confidentiality is legitimate, but it does not mean immunity from lawful orders. Fourth, use immigration tools sparingly and transparently. Revoking visas to punish speech corrodes our democratic norms and gives foreign actors a mirror they can use to delegitimize us. And finally, strategic moves, whether supplying tech, negotiating with difficult partners, or prosecuting diplomacy, should be accompanied by coherent policy objectives and exit ramps so we can measure success and avoid arbitrary reversals. Here's what I want you to take away. This hearing is not simply theater. It exposed a pattern, policy choices framed as national interest, but implemented in ways that raise moral, legal, and strategic questions. Those choices have winners and losers. The winners are often political allies. The losers are ordinary people, refugees, students, and sometimes U.S. strategic interests. If we want a foreign policy that strengthens America, it must be principled, legally accountable, and economically and morally sustainable. What do you think? Is it acceptable for a country to prioritize political loyalty or short-term wins over consistent protection for people in crisis? Should courts be able to check the executive in these sensitive areas? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Be specific. Point to a policy you think should change, or an example where the executive was right to act without congressional or judicial input. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who cares about foreign policy that actually reflects American law and law. I'll be back with more clear, evidence-based analysis from hearings like this, because understanding how policy affects real people is how we hold power accountable.